Hello, you beautiful lot, and welcome back to The Observing Eye. Today we're going to go to Czechoslovakia back in 1977, and we're going to spend some time with a philosopher called Jan Patočka. Now, Jan Patočka knew that thinking is not safe, that the truth is not just a value that you admire, it is a total claim on how you actually live. He was 69 years old when the secret police sat him down and questioned him for 11 hours. His crime was signing a document that simply asked his government to honour the commitments it had already made on paper. Now, he didn't really walk out of that interrogation room, and this is his story. It's a bit of a tough one this week, so strap in. Picture an old man in a room with no windows. He is 69 years old. His hands have held Husserl's manuscripts. His mind has moved through Plato and Heidegger and the long, cold corridors of Czech history. He has been forbidden to teach, forbidden to publish, forbidden to exist in any officially recognized intellectual capacity for most of his adult life. He has watched the Nazis take his country. He has watched the communists take it again. He has spent decades running illegal philosophy seminars in private apartments, lecturing to students who came at personal risk, passing hand-typed manuscripts through networks of people who understood that ideas could get you arrested. And now he is sitting across from men whose job is to make him stop. They will question him for 11 hours. He will not walk out of that building. This is Jan Patočka. And before you decide he has nothing to do with your life, before you reach for the comfortable distance that separates a Czech philosopher dying in 1977 from whatever you're carrying right now, I want you to sit with this one question. Not what he believed, not what he wrote, just this. What would it take for you to walk into that room? Not the interrogation room, your room, the one you've been avoiding. Philosophy, in the version most of us inherited, is a subject. Something that happened in ancient Greece got complicated in Germany and is now stored safely in universities where it can't hurt anyone. It is the kind of thing you have opinions about without it costing you anything. Patočka spent his entire life dismantling that version of philosophy. He understood with the particular clarity of someone who had watched history arrive in person that thinking is not safe. That to actually follow an idea to its conclusion, to live in truth rather than simply discuss it, is one of the most dangerous things a human being can do. Not dangerous in the metaphorical sense, dangerous in the 11 hours in a windowless room sense. This season, we've been moving through thinkers who understood philosophy as survival, thinkers who didn't have the luxury of treating ideas as decoration. Patočka belongs in that company not just because of how he died, but because of how he lived. The 30 years of marginalization, the underground seminars, the samizdat essays passed from hand to hand like contraband, the daily decision to refuse the comfortable lie, even when the comfortable lie was the only thing being offered. He called it living in truth. 3 words that sound simple until you actually try it. We are going to spend this episode finding out what those words cost, what they require, and what they make possible that nothing else can. 835 feet. Jan Patočka was born in 1907 in Turnov, a small town in Bohemia, at the tail end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He arrived into a world that was already a dead man walking, though it hadn't received the news yet. Within a decade, the empire would be gone, shattered by the First World War into a collection of new nations trying to remember who they were without the structure that had always told them. You know that feeling. The thing that organized your identity disappears and suddenly you're standing in the rubble asking a question you never needed to ask before. Who am I when the context that defined me is gone? Out of that rubble, Czechoslovakia emerged, and under Tomáš Masaryk, a philosopher who became a president, which tells you everything about what that country believed was possible, something extraordinary happened. A genuine democratic civilization. Not a perfect one, but one that took ideas seriously. One that understood freedom not as a slogan on a government building, but as something that required your actual participation, your actual honesty, your actual willingness to think rather than just repeat. Patočka grew up breathing that air. He understood from the beginning in his bones that philosophy was not a subject. It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that a society either has the courage to keep asking or slowly dies without ever noticing what it lost. He was a serious student, the kind of serious that isn't about grades or status, but about genuine hunger. The hunger of a person who has looked at the world and found it insufficient and needs to understand why. He went to Prague, then Paris, then to the German universities where the most dangerous thinking in Europe was happening. In Freiburg he found Husserl, Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, then in his 70s and still working with the focused intensity of a man who knows exactly what he's looking for. Husserl wanted to do something that sounds simple and is almost impossibly difficult. He wanted to describe what actually happens when a human being experiences the world. Before the theories arrive, before the habits calcify, before you stop seeing what is actually in front of you because you're too busy seeing what you expect. Strip it back. Get underneath the assumptions. Find the raw structure of consciousness before culture and language and self-protection have finished their work on it. That idea entered Patočka like a splinter that never came out. Then there was Heidegger. Martin Heidegger, the most seismic philosophical presence in Europe at the time, Husserl's former student. The man who took his teacher's careful phenomenology and drove it off a cliff into the deepest possible question. Not how do we experience things, but what does it mean to exist at all? What is the structure of this condition you find yourself in, thrown into a world you didn't choose, moving toward a death you can't negotiate with, responsible for a life that came with no instructions and no guarantee that any of it means anything? Being and Time, published in 1927, hit European philosophy like a controlled demolition. Patočka was in those rooms. He sat in those seminars. He felt what it was like to have the comfortable floor of philosophical tradition pulled out from underneath him and discover that falling, done honestly, was more illuminating than standing still had ever been. He carried both of them home. Husserl's insistence on looking at what is actually there, Heidegger's refusal to flinch from what being human actually involves. Two voices, two demands, and the tension between them would turn out to be exactly the right preparation for what was coming. Because in 1939, history stopped being theoretical. The Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia. The universities closed. Patočka, 32 years old and just beginning to build the life his formation had been pointing toward, was forbidden to teach. Not discouraged or defunded, forbidden. The intellectual infrastructure of his existence was dismantled by decree, and he was left standing in the wreckage of a career that had barely started, in a country that was no longer his country, in a world that had just demonstrated very clearly that it did not require his permission to destroy everything he had built. You think you know what this feels like because you've had bad years. You haven't had this. This is not a setback. This is history sitting across from you and explaining that your entire framework for understanding your place in the world was contingent on conditions that no longer exist. This is the ground not shifting but disappearing. This is 32 years old, and suddenly you are not a philosopher with a future. You are a man in an occupied country with a head full of ideas that nobody with power has any use for. Most people learn to be smaller when that happens. They learn the art of taking up less space, wanting less, saying less, becoming a quieter and more manageable version of themselves until eventually the managed version feels like the real one. It is not cowardice, it is survival. And survival is not nothing. But Patočka didn't get smaller. He thought. Not because he was performing courage for an audience, but because thinking was not what he did, it was what he was. And during those years of enforced silence, with no seminars and no journals and no institutions to hold his ideas in place, something in the quality of his thinking changed. The questions that Husserl had asked about experience and the questions Heidegger had asked about existence stopped being academic problems and became something else entirely. They became the questions that history was forcing him to answer, not with arguments, but with the actual texture of how he lived each day. The war ended. The Nazis were defeated. For 3 years, between 1945 and 1948, something like the earlier world came back. He taught at Charles University. He published. He breathed. Then 1948, the communist coup, and the floor disappeared again. The universities were restructured around ideology. Philosophy that didn't serve the party's version of history was not philosophy. It was deviation, mystification, the enemy of progress. Patočka's entire way of thinking, patient, careful, oriented toward the irreducible complexity of actual human experience, was exactly what the New Order had no use for. He was marginalized, then banned from university teaching entirely, eventually assigned to archive work. He was 41 years old. Twice before 50, history had walked into his life and removed the institutional basis of his existence. Now here's a question for you. When the structure that holds your identity in place gets taken away, what is left? When you can no longer be what the institution said you were, what are you? When the context that made your thinking legible disappears, do you still think? Do you still know what you believe when the believing has no audience, no reward, no official recognition that it even happened? And sorry, I recognize that was like 4 questions, not 1, but just hold those. Hold those as we go through the episode. Patočka was about to spend the next 30 years finding out, and he was only just beginning to understand how much further down it was going to go. Losing everything clarifies the mind. Not immediately, not kindly, not in a way that the self-help books promise, where the loss arrives and the lesson follows and you emerge on the other side with a cleaner relationship to what matters. It clarifies the way a fever clarifies, by burning through everything that wasn't load-bearing and leaving you alone with the structure underneath. The structure you never looked at because you were too busy decorating the walls. Patočka lost his position, lost his platform, lost the institutional permission to be what he had spent his entire formation becoming. And in that burning, something became visible that the comfortable years had kept hidden. Not a revelation, something quieter and more durable. A question. The question that phenomenology had always been pointing toward, but that required the removal of every comfortable distraction before it could be heard clearly. What is actually here? Not what should be here. Not what was here before they took it. Not what you're hoping will come back. What is actually, irreducibly, undeniably here when you stop filling the space with noise. This is where Patočka went after 1948. Not into bitterness, though he would have been entitled to it. And not into silence, though silence was what the regime was trying to impose. He went deeper into the work, into phenomenology, into the patient, almost violent discipline of looking at the human experience without flinching and describing what you actually find rather than what you wish were there. Phenomenology is a word that sounds like it belongs in a locked cabinet in a library. I'm also surprised I've been able to say it so many times without fluffing. Fluffing up, not fluffing. It doesn't. It belongs in your chest. It belongs in the place where you go when the story you've been telling about your life stops working and you need to find out what's underneath the story. Husserl built the method. Heidegger radicalized it. Patočka did something neither of them had done. He lived it under conditions that tested it. He developed during these years his own framework for understanding human existence, not borrowed from his teachers, not a synthesis of the German tradition, something that emerged from the specific texture of his experience, Czech, occupied, silenced, and stubbornly present. He described human existence as structured around 3 fundamental movements, not stages or phases that you pass through and leave behind. These were movements like a piece of music that are always, in some sense, all happening at once. The first movement is the movement of rooting, anchoring. This is the movement of acceptance, of receiving the world as home, of allowing yourself to be held by what is given. The warmth of the body, the familiarity of place, the comfort of belonging to something larger than yourself, family, community, tradition, the simple animal fact of being alive in a world that sustains you. This is the ground. Without it, nothing else is possible. But the first movement is also the movement of unconsciousness, of taking the given for granted, of living inside the gift without ever asking what it cost or whether it will last. The first movement is where most people spend most of their lives, and there is nothing wrong with that until history arrives and removes the ground, and suddenly the rooting that felt like strength turns out to have been dependency all along. The second movement is the movement of work, of self-projection, of reaching beyond what is given toward what you intend to make real. This is the movement of ambition, of vocation, of the human refusal to simply accept the world as it arrives. You build things, you make things, you extend yourself into the future through your projects, your relationships, your labor, your art. The second movement is where identity gets constructed, not received, like in the first movement, but made through effort, through choice, through the accumulation of what you have done and what you have refused to do. This is the movement that the regime was trying to destroy when it took Patočka's position. Because the second movement requires a world that is at least minimally willing to receive what you are making. When the institutions close, when the publications stop, when the students are forbidden to come, the second movement has nowhere to go. And then there's the third movement, the movement of truth. And the third movement doesn't need the institutions, it doesn't need the official recognition, it doesn't need the world to be cooperative or even survivable. The third movement is the movement that becomes available precisely when everything that supported the first two has been taken away. It is the movement of confronting what is real, not what is comfortable, not what is sanctioned, not what the available structures will reward you for believing, but what is actually irreducibly true about your situation and your existence and the world that you find yourself in. The third movement is what happens when a human being stops managing their relationship with reality and simply enters it. Most people never get there, and it's not because they're cowards. It's because the first two movements are genuinely absorbing. Life gives you enough to root into and enough to build toward that the third movement never becomes necessary. You can live a full human life entirely inside the first two movements and never know what you missed. But some people get pushed. By history, by loss, by the particular violence of having the first two movements stripped away before you were finished with them. And in that stripping, if they don't collapse into bitterness or nostalgia or the frantic attempt to reconstruct what was taken, they find something that the comfortable life never offered. Direct contact with what is real. Patočka was being pushed, hard, toward the third movement. And he was discovering something about it that he needed to understand before he could teach it. The third movement is not heroic. It is not the dramatic gesture or the public stand or the moment of cinematic courage. It is something much quieter and more demanding than any of that. It is the daily, unglamorous, unwitnessed choice to keep looking at what is actually there, to keep thinking honestly when dishonest thinking would be safer and more comfortable and completely understandable given your circumstances, to refuse not loudly, not performatively, just privately and consistently the comfortable lie. This is what he was practicing in the years when nobody was watching. But he was also watching something else during these years. He was watching his country practice the comfortable lie at a civilizational scale. He was watching an entire society learn to say what the regime required and believe, or at least perform the belief, that the requirement was reasonable. He was watching the slow daily negotiation that people make with power when power controls the terms of survival. And he was understanding with the particular clarity of someone who had been thinking carefully about human experience for decades what that negotiation costs. Not the obvious cost, not the political or the social cost, the interior cost. The cost to the structure of a person's consciousness when they practice, day after day, the discipline of not seeing what they see. When they train themselves out of the third movement and back into the managed, sanctioned, officially approved version of the first two. But this isn't just about Czechoslovakia in the 1950s. It's about the lie you told so smoothly this morning that you didn't even register it as a lie. The thing you didn't say in the meeting. The feeling you didn't name because naming it would have cost you something you weren't ready to spend. The thought you shut down before it finished forming because you already knew where it was going and you didn't want to go there. The regime didn't invent that, it just made it mandatory. And Patočka was beginning to understand that optional or mandatory, voluntary or coerced, the mechanism was the same. The third movement was being foreclosed, and something essential about what it meant to be human was being lost in that foreclosure. One small, daily compromise at a time. He needed to find a way to say this that people could hear, and he was about to find it. A totalitarian regime doesn't want your suffering. Suffering is inefficient and draws attention. It doesn't want your silence. Silence can look like dignity, and dignity is dangerous. What it wants, what it needs, what it cannot function without is your participation, your daily, voluntary, low-stakes cooperation with the fiction that he's asking everyone to maintain. It wants you to say the words, fill in the forms, attend the meetings, nod at the right moments, not because you believe it, doesn't care whether you believe it. It wants you to perform belief loudly enough and consistently enough that the performance becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. First for the people watching, then, if it works correctly, for yourself. This is not a metaphor for something that happened in Czechoslovakia. This is a description of a mechanism that operates everywhere there is power and fear and the human need to survive inside structures that do not deserve survival. Patočka watched it happen in real time. He watched an entire society, educated people, thoughtful people, people who knew perfectly well what was true, slowly, daily, incrementally learn to perform the required fiction. Not because they were weak, because the cost of not performing it was immediate and concrete, and the cost of performing it was abstract and deferred, and easy to rationalize one more day. Just today, just this meeting, just this signature, just this one small genuflection toward the line, then tomorrow I will be more honest. Tomorrow never came. It never does. And Patočka, sitting in his archive, banned from teaching, surrounded by the manuscripts he was cataloguing rather than writing, was thinking about what this mechanism was actually doing to the people inside it. Not politically, but philosophically, psychologically, at the level of the third movement, at the level of what happens to a human consciousness when it practices as a daily discipline the foreclosure of honest perception. He had a word for it. Several words, actually, assembled over years of thinking into something that cut clean and deep. He called it living in untruth, and he meant something precise by it. Not lying in the obvious sense, not cynicism or nihilism or the conscious decision to deceive. He meant the slower, quieter, more insidious process by which a person gradually surrenders their direct relationship with reality in exchange for the safety of the approved version. The process by which the third movement, the movement of truth, of genuine contact with what is real, gets traded away for the comfort and security of remaining inside the first two movements undisturbed. Living in untruth is not a dramatic fall. It is a series of very small steps, each one completely reasonable. Each one taken by a person who still considers themselves honest, who still believes they are simply being pragmatic, simply surviving, choosing their battles. Until one day the distance between who they actually are and what they actually present to the world has become so vast, so normalized, so thoroughly incorporated into their daily functioning that they can no longer locate the original self that the performance was supposed to be protecting. The self that was supposed to be waiting safely behind the mask has quietly become the mask. This is what Patočka was watching, and this is what he needed to find a way to interrupt. He could not publish officially. He could not teach in any recognized institution, but he could still think, and he could still talk to people who are willing to come to him at personal risk in private apartments after dark and think alongside him. The underground seminars began. Students, intellectuals, artists, people who were hungry for genuine philosophical conversation in a country where genuine philosophical conversation had been made officially unavailable. They came, quietly, carefully. They sat in cramped living rooms and listened to a banned philosopher lecture on Plato and Heidegger and the meaning of European civilization and what it might mean to live honestly inside a system specifically designed to make honesty costly. Think about what that is. Not the romantic version of it, the heroic dissident circle, the glowing underground fire of intellectual resistance. The actual texture of it. You're a student. You want to come to these seminars. You know that coming could get you expelled from your university, could cost your parents their jobs, could put you on a list that follows you for decades. You come anyway. Not because you're not afraid, but because the alternative, the officially approved curriculum, the managed version of philosophy, the intellectual life that has been pre-sanitized to remove anything that might produce genuine friction with reality, has started to feel like a different kind of cost. The cost of never actually thinking. The cost of spending your entire formation inside the comfortable lie and emerging on the other side with a credential and an empty interior. Some costs are only visible from inside the third movement. During these years, Patočka was writing the essays that would eventually be collected under the title Heretical Essays in the Philosophy of History. Heretical. He chose that word deliberately. These were not position papers, not political manifestos. They weren't calls to action in any conventional sense. They were philosophical essays about the history of European civilization and what had gone wrong with it, but written with the kind of urgency that only becomes available when the writer is living inside the problem rather than observing it from a safe distance. His central argument was this: European civilization had been founded on a particular experience, the experience of the shaken, the moment first visible in ancient Greece in the philosophical revolution that Socrates embodied and died for, when a human being's inherited certainties collapse and they are forced to encounter reality directly, without the protection of tradition or custom or the comforting noise of what everyone around them already believes. This experience is not pleasant. It is not meant to be. It is the experience of the ground disappearing, of finding yourself suddenly responsible for your own relationship with truth, rather than simply inheriting a relationship that was already there. Socrates didn't just ask difficult questions, he was the difficult question. His entire existence was a challenge to the Athenian assumption that the inherited framework was sufficient, that the official version of reality was real enough, that a person could live well simply by functioning competently inside the available structures. Athens killed him for it, and in killing him, Athens demonstrated exactly what Patočka was watching Czechoslovakia demonstrate 2,500 years later, that the shaking is not what systems fear. What the systems fear is the person who has been shaken and didn't collapse. The person who went through the loss of the comfortable ground and came out the other side, not with a new ideology and not with a replacement certainty, but with a direct, unmediated, unmanageable relationship with what is real. That person cannot be fully controlled, because control operates through the management of what people believe they need, and the shaken person has already discovered that what they actually need is not what the system is offering. This is what living in truth meant. Not a lifestyle, not a disposition, not the admirable personal quality of being generally honest in your dealings with people. It meant the active, daily, costly refusal to surrender your direct relationship with reality. It meant practicing the third movement even when, especially when, everything around you was organized to make the third movement unnecessary, and the first two movements sufficient and comfortable and officially approved. Václav Havel read these essays. Havel, who would later become the president of a free Czechoslovakia, but who was then a playwright under constant surveillance, a man living the precise tension between authentic existence and the managed performance the regime demanded. Havel read Patočka and felt something he later described as recognition. Not agreement with the position, recognition of a truth he had already been living but hadn't yet had the philosophical language to name. Living in truth. 3 words. Havel took them and built a political philosophy around them, a movement, eventually a revolution. But that comes later. Right now, what matters is the cost. Because living in truth is not a philosophy you can admire from a distance. It is not something you can appreciate intellectually and then set down and go back to your life. The moment you actually understand what Patočka is saying, the moment it lands, not in your head but in the place where you actually live, it becomes a question you cannot unfeel. How much of what you present to the world is the performance the available structures require? How much of what you believe has been pre-approved by the systems you depend on for your survival? How many times today did you foreclose the third movement before it could finish forming because you already knew where it was going, and going there was going to cost you something that you weren't ready to spend? The regime made it mandatory, but you get to choose, which, when you think about it, makes it worse. Loneliness is not the absence of people. You can be surrounded by people, at the dinner table, in the meeting, at the party where everyone is performing their most presentable selves, and be more alone than you have ever been in your life. That kind of loneliness is not about proximity. It is about the gap between what you are actually experiencing and what the available social scripts will allow you to say about it. It's the loneliness of the person who has been shaken and is now sitting inside a world full of people who are working very hard not to be. You know this feeling. You've sat in that room. You've smiled at that dinner table. You've given the required answer to the question of how you're doing and watched the person asking it visibly relax because the required answer meant they didn't have to actually look at you. Sometimes I wish I actually gave people the right answer. How are you? Yes, I'm fine. I'm fine. Oh, fuck off. I'm fine. Patočka knew it too. He'd been living inside it for decades, banned, marginalized, officially non-existent as an intellectual presence, surrounded by a society practicing the daily discipline of managed unreality. You can tell, the further I get into reading the script, the more I fluff up. Or fuck up. I can probably say fuck up now, can't I? We're all adults. Yeah, it gets worse. More editing required. Anyway, what was I saying? I've gone off track. Patočka knew it too. And he was thinking about what connects people, what actually connects them, underneath the performed connections, underneath the social contracts and the shared fictions and the mutual agreement to maintain the comfortable distance from what is real. What he arrived at was one of the most quietly devastating ideas in 20th century philosophy. He called it the solidarity of the shaken. And I want you to hold that phrase for a moment before I explain it, because the explanation is going to be precise and the precision matters. The solidarity of the shaken is not the solidarity of the suffering. It is not the bond that forms between people who have been through similar difficulties and comfort each other with the knowledge that they are not alone in their pain. That bond is real and it matters, but it is not what Patočka is talking about. The solidarity of the suffering is still organized around the content of the experience, around what happened, around the shared story of what was taken or lost or destroyed. The solidarity of the shaken is different. It is organized around the structure of the experience, around what the shaking did to a person's relationship with certainty, with the inherited framework, with the comfortable ground of the first two movements. Here is what he meant. When a person has genuinely been shaken, not inconvenienced, not challenged, not made temporarily uncomfortable, but actually shaken in the way that strips away the structures that were organizing their sense of what is real and what matters and what can be relied upon, something changes in the architecture of their consciousness. The thing that changes is not their beliefs. It is their relationship to belief itself. They no longer hold their certainties in the same way. They no longer confuse the map for the territory. They no longer mistake the inherited framework for the reality it was supposed to be pointing toward. This is not nihilism. Patočka was not saying that the shaken person believes in nothing. He was saying that the shaken person believes differently, with more honesty, with more awareness of the contingency of what they hold, with less investment in defending the framework and more capacity for genuine contact with what is actually there. And when two people who have been shaken in this way encounter each other, something becomes possible that is not possible between people who are still inside the managed comfort of the unshaken life. A recognition, not of shared content, shared beliefs, shared experiences, shared identity. A recognition of shared structure. The structure of having had the ground removed, of having found out the hard way that the ground was never as solid as it appeared, of having survived that discovery and come out the other side, not with a replacement certainty, but with something more durable and more honest than certainty ever was. That recognition is the solidarity of the shaken. And here's why it's politically and philosophically explosive. Every other form of solidarity is manipulable. Every other form of solidarity can be co-opted, redirected, weaponized by a sufficiently determined power. The solidarity of ideology can be redirected when the ideology is revised. The solidarity of identity can be divided when the identity is challenged. The solidarity of shared interest can be broken when the interests are separated. Every form of solidarity built on positive content, on what people share and what they believe and what they want, is vulnerable to the power that controls the definition of those things. The solidarity of the shaken cannot be co-opted, because it is not built on anything the system can offer or remove. It is built on the shared experience of having discovered that the system's offerings were never the point. It is built on the ruins of exactly the kind of positive content that power uses to divide and manage and redirect. You cannot bribe the solidarity of the shaken with ideology because the shaken person already knows what ideology costs. You cannot threaten it with loss because loss is where it was born. This is why Charter 77 was possible. Look at who signed it. Catholics who despised the communist regime's atheism. Marxists who believed the regime had betrayed genuine socialism. Liberals who wanted Western-style democracy. Artists who simply wanted to make work without having to perform the required fiction. Former party members who had watched their own certainties collapse from the inside. People who agreed on almost nothing except this. The regime was lying. They knew it was lying, and they were no longer willing to perform the agreement that the lie was acceptable. That is the solidarity of the shaken in practice. Not an ideology, not a shared vision of what should replace what they were refusing, just the shared refusal, the shared recognition between people who had each been broken open by reality in their own particular way, that the breaking had given them something more valuable than whatever the comfortable life had been protecting. It gave them each other. Patočka co-signed Charter 77 in January of 1977. He was 69 years old. He had spent 30 years in the philosophical wilderness, thinking, teaching illegally, writing essays that circulated as contraband, watching his country practice managed unreality at a civilizational scale. And now he was signing his name to a document that said, simply and precisely and with full awareness of the consequences, this is not acceptable and we are no longer pretending that it is. Think about what 30 years of preparation for a moment feels like. Think about the particular quality of a decision that is not really a decision at all, because everything you have thought and written and taught and been for 3 decades has been moving toward exactly this, and the only question that remains is whether you will be consistent, whether you will live in the specific and costly sense that Patočka meant in truth. He was consistent. But I need you to take something from the solidarity of the shaken before we get to what happened next. It's not a historical concept. It's not a description of what brave people in Czechoslovakia experienced in the 1970s. It is a description of something that is available right now in your life if you are willing to admit what has actually shaken you. Because the thing about the shaken life is that you don't get to choose whether the shaking happens. History chooses, loss chooses, the body chooses. Reality, in its absolute indifference to your preferences, chooses. The only choice you actually have is what you do with the shaking after it arrives. Whether you use every available mechanism, and there are many, and they are comfortable, and they are socially approved, to rebuild the managed certainty as quickly as possible and get back inside the unshaken life. Or whether you stay in the ruins long enough to find out what is actually there. Long enough to find out who else is there. The solidarity of the shaken is not just a political category. It is a description of the deepest form of human connection available. The connection that forms not between people who are performing their most presentable versions of themselves, but between people who have stopped performing, who have been shaken too thoroughly for the performance to hold, who are sitting in the rubble of whatever organized their lives before the shaking arrived and are willing, finally, to look at each other without the protective layer of managed unreality between them. You've met these people. You may not have recognized them at the time because the meeting probably didn't look like a philosophy seminar or a dissident gathering. Probably looked like 2 people in a kitchen at 2 a.m. saying the thing that doesn't get said. It probably looked like a conversation that felt more real than most of what passes for connection in the daylight hours. The moment when the performance dropped and something genuine moved between 2 human beings who had both, in their own ways and for their own reasons, been broken open by reality. That is the solidarity of the shaken. Patočka built a revolution on it. What are you building? In our final section of this episode, we're going to talk about courage. Not the cinematic version, not the swelling music and the slow motion running and the moment where the hero makes the dramatic gesture that the narrative has been building towards, walking away from an explosion and not looking back. That version of courage is designed to make you feel something without requiring you to do anything. It's courage as spectacle, courage as entertainment, courage that you can admire from a safe distance and then set down when the credits roll and go back to your life feeling vaguely inspired without a single thing having actually changed. Real courage looks like an old man getting dressed in the morning, knowing what the day is going to contain. It looks like 69 years old and bad health and 30 years of marginalization and the full, clear, unromantic awareness that the people who want you to stop are not going to be polite about it. It looks like the decision, the quiet, private, entirely unglamorous decision to be consistent, to live one more time in the way you have been arguing people should live for 3 decades. To enter the third movement not because it's safe or rewarded or even survivable, but because the alternative is to become, at the end of your life, the thing you spent your life refusing to become. A person who said one thing and lived another. January 1977. Charter 77 is announced. Patočka is one of 3 initial spokespeople alongside Václav Havel and the former Foreign Minister Jiří Hájek. The document itself is not a revolutionary manifesto. It is not a call to arms. It is not even particularly radical in its demands. It simply states that the Czechoslovak government has signed international human rights agreements, the Helsinki Accords, the United Nations covenants, and that the signatories believe the government should honour the commitments it has already made on paper. That is all. No programme, no ideology, no vision of the new society that should replace the existing one. Just this. You said this was true, we are holding you to it. The regime's response was immediate and furious, because the regime understood something that a casual observer might miss. The danger of Charter 77 was not its content, the danger was its structure. It was the solidarity of the shaken made visible. It was Catholics and Marxists and liberals and artists and former party members all signing the same document, and the fact of their signing it together was itself the message. The message was that the managed divisions, the ideological categories, the identity boundaries, the carefully maintained separations between different kinds of people that made them easier to control, had been crossed. That the shaking had produced something the system had no mechanism to contain. You cannot argue with the solidarity of the shaken. You cannot offer it a better deal. You cannot redirect it toward an approved channel. You can only try to destroy it. So they tried. Signatories lost jobs. Children were expelled from universities. People were followed, harassed, interrogated. The full apparatus of a state that has spent decades perfecting the mechanisms of social control was directed at a document signed by a few hundred people that made no demands beyond the simple, devastating requirement for consistency. Patočka was interrogated repeatedly in the weeks following the Charter's announcement. He was 69 years old, he had a heart condition, he had spent the better part of 3 decades in conditions of intellectual and professional deprivation that had taken a physical toll that his age was not equipped to absorb. None of this was unknown to the people interrogating him. The point of the interrogation was not to extract information. It was to break something. To produce, in a man who had built his entire philosophical life around the refusal to perform the required fiction, the performance, the recantation, the visible, public, usable evidence that even Jan Patočka, at the end of everything, could be made to be smaller. On March 3rd, 1977, he was subjected to an interrogation lasting approximately 11 hours. 11 hours. Hold that number. Not as an abstraction, as a physical reality. 11 hours in a room with no windows, with men whose professional function is the application of psychological pressure, at 69 years old, with a damaged heart, after weeks of repeated interrogations that had already taken more from his body than his body had to give. He suffered a brain hemorrhage. He was taken to hospital. He died on March 13th, 1977, 10 days after the interrogation. The official cause was cerebrovascular disease. The actual cause was that the state had applied sufficient pressure to a 69-year-old man's body that his body stopped. His funeral became itself an act of philosophy made physical. Foreign diplomats attended specifically to protect the mourners from police interference. The regime that has spent 30 years trying to make Patočka officially non-existent had, by killing him, made him permanently visible. The man they had interrogated to death became the argument for everything he had argued for in life. You cannot kill an idea by killing the person who had it, especially not when the killing proves the idea. But I want to stay with something for a moment before we move toward what his death meant. I want to stay with the question of what he knew going in, because this is not a story about a man who was surprised by what happened to him. Patočka was not naive about the regime's methods. He was not optimistic about his own physical condition. He was not operating under the illusion that signing Charter 77 was a safe act, or that the interrogations would be gentle, or that his age and his reputation would protect him from the full weight of what the state was willing to do to people who refused the required performance. He knew. The evidence of everything he wrote, everything he taught, everything he had been thinking about for 30 years suggests that he knew with considerable clarity what the territory he was entering contained. And he entered it anyway. Not because he had a death wish, not because he was performing heroism for an audience. He entered it because he had spent 30 years teaching that the third movement, the movement of truth, of genuine contact with reality, of the refusal to manage your existence down to those sides, of the refusal to manage your existence down to a size the available structures find acceptable, is not a movement you enter only when it's safe. It's not a movement you practice in private and abandon in public. It's not a philosophy you hold until the holding becomes expensive and then quietly set down. It is what you are, or it is nothing. This is the thing about living in truth that the comfortable interpretation always misses. It's not a value you add to your life like a supplement. It's not a practice you maintain alongside the other practices. It's a total claim. It claims everything. It claims the comfortable hours and the dangerous hours and the hours in a windowless room with men who are professionally dedicated to making you stop. It claims your reputation and your safety and your remaining years. It claims, if necessary, the years themselves. Patočka had known this since the underground seminars, since the samizdat essays, since the decades of marginalization that had stripped away every comfort except the one the regime could never reach, the interior, unmanageable, absolutely private commitment to perceiving and naming what is real. They couldn't take that. They tried for 11 hours and they couldn't take it. So they broke the body that was carrying it. Now here's what I want you to sit with. Not the martyrdom, not the heroism, the consistency. Patočka didn't become someone different in that interrogation room. He didn't discover a reserve of courage he didn't know he had. He didn't make a dramatic choice in a moment of crisis. He was, in that room, exactly the same person he had been in the private apartments lecturing to students who had come at personal risk. Exactly the same person who had spent 30 years thinking carefully about what it means to live in truth rather than simply discuss it. Exactly the same person who had taught over and over that the third movement is not a movement you enter for the comfortable parts and abandon when it gets cold. He was consistent. That is all. And consistency, when it is total and when it is tested, looks indistinguishable from courage because we have so few examples of what it actually is. Now here's the question that his consistency is asking you. Not whether you would do what he did. That question is way too large and too distant and too easy to answer hypothetically without it costing us anything. The question is smaller and closer and considerably harder. Where in your life are you being inconsistent? Where is the gap between what you say you believe and how you actually live? Where is the place where your philosophy, your actual lived embodied philosophy, not the one you would describe if someone asked, but the one legible in your daily choices, where is the place where that philosophy stops short of the thing it would require if you were actually serious about it? You're not going to be interrogated for 11 hours. Nobody's going to break your body for the crime of thinking clearly. The pressure you face is smaller and quieter and considerably easier to rationalize as something other than what it is. Which means you have less excuse than he had, and more room. Come back to the old man in the room with no windows. Not as a martyr, not as a monument. What Patočka's life actually is, when you strip away the historical distance and the philosophical credentials and the comfortable reverence we extend to the dead so we don't have to take seriously what they were saying to the living, is a mirror. Held up to the part of you that already knows the difference between the life you are performing and the life you are actually living. The part that registers the gap every time you foreclose the third movement before it finishes forming. Every time you give the required answer. Every time you manage yourself down to a size the available structures find acceptable. And tell yourself that this is just how things work and everyone does it and the alternative is not realistic. Patočka spent 30 years in a philosophical wilderness, not because history was cruel, though history was cruel, but because he refused to purchase his way out of the wilderness by becoming something he wasn't. He refused the comfortable lie when the comfortable lie was the only thing on offer. He did this quietly, consistently, without audience or reward, in private apartments and archive rooms and the long interior silences of a life lived at the margins of what his society was willing to officially recognize. And then, at 69, he did it one final time in the room he didn't walk out of. The shaking is not the enemy. That is what he knew. The shaking is the beginning of the only honest life available to a human being who is paying attention. The loss of the comfortable ground is not the catastrophe. The catastrophe is the reconstruction. The frantic, socially approved, internally exhausting project of rebuilding managed certainty over the place where the ground used to be. So you never have to feel again what it felt like when it disappeared. The solidarity of the shaken is waiting for you on the other side of that reconstruction project. The third movement is waiting. The direct, unmediated, unmanageable contact with what is real is waiting. Not as a reward, not as a destination, as a permanent availability. As the thing that is always there underneath the performance whenever you are ready to stop performing. You don't have to sign anything. Nobody's going to interrogate you. The stakes of your particular living in truth are almost certainly not mortal. Which means the only thing standing between you and it is you. Not history, not the regime, not the men in the windowless room. Just a small, daily, entirely voluntary choice to foreclose the verb movement one more time. To give the required answer one more time. To be, one more time, the managed and acceptable and officially approved version of a person who once, in a quieter moment, knew exactly what was real. Patočka made a different choice. Every single day for 30 years, and then once more at the end. What are you going to do with yours? If the solidarity of the shaken feels more like a demand than a comfort, that should tell you something. And if you want to keep standing in the ruins with me, you can find the show in all the usual digital feeding troughs. We're on TikTok, Instagram and X with the handle @TheObservingEye. And we're on YouTube at youtube.com/@TheObservingEye as well. And then there's Substack, of course, which is our home base, at theobservingeye.com. You go there if you want the full transcripts, the deeper explorations, and the stuff that doesn't fit in the podcast because it requires you to sit with it a little bit. Completely ad-free, of course, because advertisements are just the first movement teaching you to consume your way back to comfort. Advertisement. Buy my wares. If something in this episode is making it harder to give the required answer tomorrow morning, don't silence it. Join the conversation. Drop a comment. Send a message. Fire an email into the digital void at david@theobservingeye.com. I am on the other end, shaken but not stirred. And if you want to support the show, don't just passively consume it. Share it. Give it to the person who thinks the ground beneath them is solid, or the one who needs to remember that the shaking is not the enemy. As always, thank you to all of you for tuning in and listening today. I really appreciate you spending your time here, and I hope that you've got something that you can take away and have a think about afterwards, and that you're not just existentially terrified by the things that we cover in these episodes. Of course, if you are, drop me a message. We'll see if we can work through that. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm getting to the end now. It's been a tough episode. I found that challenging, going through some of Patočka's history, particularly at the end. That was tough. But thank you for, sitting with it and paying attention, as always. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.